Welcome to another episode of 10 Minute Land Surveyor. I'm Dave Woolley. Today I'm going to focus on California's first Surveyor General, John Coffey Hays, Jack Hays. Now that name might sound familiar to you because Jack Hays is actually regarded as one of the greatest Texas Rangers that ever lived. His career as a Texas Ranger far overshadowed his career as a land surveyor. But I'm going to talk a little bit about both today. Jack Hays was born in 1817 in Tennessee. His father served in the War of 1812 under John Coffey. As a boy, Jack Hays was regularly surrounded by people like Andrew Jackson and John Coffey, porch talk in Tennessee. As was not entirely uncommon, both of his parents died when he was about 15 years old. They split the family up of 7 or 8 kids, and Jack had to go to Mississippi with the younger siblings. Once he got to Mississippi, he was trained as a land surveyor. Jack Hays' history is well documented. There's a lot of information available. The book that I'm relying on most is Colonel Jack Hays by Greer. Bought this book from a Texas Historical Society for $150. When I discuss the Comanches, I'll be relying mostly on Empire of the Summer Moon by Gwynne. As a surveyor of 17 years old in Mississippi, Jack Hays would regularly encounter hostile Native Americans, mostly Choctaw. Now, while Jack Hays was surveying in Mississippi, Texas was fighting for sovereignty. In February of 1836 was the Battle of the Alamo. The Alamo was held by William Buck Travis. The number of soldiers in Santa Anna's army surrounding the Alamo varies, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000. The Alamo had approximately 240 people. Buck Travis pens a letter, Victory or Death, and in the last paragraph of this letter he writes, "The enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death, William Barrett Travis." As we all know, the Alamo fell, and the soldiers, Travis, Bowie, Crockett, were mutilated, put into a pile and burned. When the news of the Alamo spread throughout America, it enraged and compelled young men to go to Texas to help fight. And among those many young men that went to Texas to fight was a young Jack Hays. To settle Texas, they developed something called headrights. Head of household was entitled to so much land. It worked like this. You would commission a land surveyor, typically out of San Antonio, to go lay out the land that you wanted. That land became yours. Now, you have to understand that this was hostile native land. Now, when I talk about native land, I'm talking about almost exclusively Comanche land. Now, if you don't know anything about Comanches, just understand this. When it comes to war skills and fierceness, the Comanches were here, everybody else was here. That includes anybody that came from the east. Now, one of the reasons that the Comanches were so dominant is they were dominant horsemen. They had mastered fighting from the back of a horse. Not only were these Comanches dominant horsemen, they were brutal warriors. One of the reasons that the Apaches, known to live in the hills and among the rocks, was it was one of the few ways they could get away from the Comanches and neutralize the horse. The Apaches didn't always live in the mountains and the rocks. They were driven there. So Jack Hays is in Bexar County, around San Antonio. He's a land surveyor, and people are migrating into Texas, and they're hiring him to lay out the headrights. The Comanches soon realized that if you see a land surveyor, that people are going to soon follow, and they made it a priority to kill the land surveyors. Now, when I talk about death by a Comanche, it's very unlikely that it would be a quick death. One of the things they were known for is scalping people while they're still alive. Now, this wasn't always done in the field or during battle. Oftentimes, they would take captives back to the tribe, and everybody would partake in the festivities. And this was the environment that Jack Hays surveyed in. Now, Hays, being an early surveyor in Texas, is very familiar with the terrain, and he was equally familiar with the Comanches. He had lost many men to Comanches. Now, can you imagine one of today's chainmen going out into the frontier with Jack Hays? One of the reasons that the Comanche dominated was because settlers shot long rifles, and a long rifle could be shot 2 to 3 times in a minute. It required them to dismount from a horse. Now, the Comanches could shoot anywhere from 6 to 10 arrows from horseback, so the firepower was vastly in the favor of the Comanches. Jack Hays was well known for his fearless nature, and they had recently formed the Texas Rangers. So Jack Hays was asked to join the Texas Rangers, and rather than be a surveyor, he was asked to protect the surveyors. So Jack Hays and a select few men would ride out in front of the surveyors and scout the area to make sure there were no Comanches. And in the event they ran into Comanches, it was their job to protect the surveyors. Now, as many as 50% of these men were killed annually. Imagine that. 50% of your staff is killed annually in some of the most horrible deaths. Now, Jack Hays happened into a warehouse which had pistols that were issued to the Texas Navy. These were the Patterson Colts, and this was one of the first Colt pistols ever patented. Now, understand that the Patterson Colt was a heavy pistol that required it to be disassembled to be reloaded. However, the Texas Rangers did not have to dismount their horses to fight with the Comanches, and this leveled the playing field. Now, there's a whole lot of history about the Patterson Colt or Sam Colt himself. I would highly recommend reading about the history of Sam Colt, the Patterson Colt, and the evolution of the pistol. Now, I'm going to take a quick sidebar here. A young Sam Walker was in the employment of Jack Hays. He wrote a letter to Sam Colt with some recommendations on improvements to the Patterson Colt. Well, by the time Sam Colt had received the letter, he had already went bankrupt and was no longer manufacturing pistols. Sam Walker got a commission to go back east to go meet with Sam Colt. Now, this wasn't a matter of getting on a plane or catching the next bus out of town. Can you imagine riding from San Antonio, Texas to the East Coast? That's what Sam Walker did just to meet with Sam Colt to talk pistols. Sam Colt's very excited to hear about the use of his pistol. As I'd mentioned earlier, he'd went through a bankruptcy, and he and Walker worked really closely on the modifications of the pistol. Now, he issued the pistol the summer of 1847 to make what became known as the Colt Walker pistol. Now, Sam Walker got one of the first editions of the Walker Colt, and he carried it for 3 or 4 months before his life was ended by a Mexican sniper at the age of 29. It makes me realize that Sam Walker did more by 29 than I'll do my whole life. Probably the same for most of you. Texas, as a new sovereign nation, was broke. They had to borrow money from the United States to continue with the fighting. And it was during these periods that Jack Hays loaned the Texas government money to continue. Now, how Jack Hays came into money was he would survey when the government didn't have enough money to pay him as a Texas Ranger. He would loan money to Texas so that he could keep his men employed. Jack Hays was responsible for the hiring decisions, and he was very selective as to who got to ride with him. There are a lot of famous people like Flacco and Bigfoot Wallace, names you would recognize. Now, you might think in today's corporate world, your hiring decisions are difficult. Well, Jack Hays had to decide who would go out with him and who wouldn't. Now, you have to understand there was a steady stream of young men looking for adventure going out west with the idea that they were going to become a Texas Ranger. Well, Jack Hays would decline many of these people. There's a story about one young man that showed up, and he had traveled from Tennessee or Georgia or somewhere with the sole purpose of joining Jack Hays and becoming a Texas Ranger. So you can imagine his disappointment when Jack Hays said, "I just don't think you're cut out for this work." Well, turns out this young man was a good horseman, and he was able to show Jack some excellent horseman skills. And against his better judgment, Jack Hays took him out. And the very next day he was killed. So when I hear a corporate executive talking about the difficulty in hiring today, I kind of wonder how Jack Hays would look upon that. We'll fast forward to 1849. Jack Hays gets a commission to lead folks from Gila River, Arizona, to San Francisco, 1849, gold rush years. After seeing what's going on in 1849 San Francisco, Jack Hays knows he needs to be there. He goes back to Texas, takes care of his affairs, leaves his wife and children, and makes his way to San Diego. In San Diego, he boards a ship, but by the time they get to San Pedro, they run into a storm and they have to dock. Once docked, Then they have to make their way to the Sepulveda family farm for a meal and lodging until the storm is gone. They continue on to San Francisco. Now understand, 1850 San Francisco was extremely dangerous. There's nothing in modern day America that compares to the crime statistics of that time. It was more in line with modern day Mogadishu. Who better to serve as the sheriff than somebody who had seen a lot of killing and had done a lot of killing? Enter Jack Hays. In 1853, Jack Hays became California's first U.S. Surveyor General. Jack Hays was known for the orderly development of the East Bay area and particularly Oakland. He purchased the land there and laid out the initial town site of Oakland, which is still in place today. Jack Hays is a very famous Texas Ranger, so much so that it overshadowed his work as a land surveyor. Now, I think a lot of his leadership skills as a Texas Ranger came from being a land surveyor. As a land surveyor, he understood precision. He understood the importance of documentation. And what's interesting is after an illustrious career as a Texas Ranger, he finished as a land surveyor. And the early development of California rested on Jack Hays, more particularly in the East Bay and modern-day Oakland. Jack Hays is buried in the Oakland Cemetery. In this brief video, I had to skip over a number of details, but as a surveyor, I think you might find it interesting to read about Jack Hays and his land surveying career. Thank you and have a nice day.